What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I try and help you guys keep on top of the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. This week on our midweek episode, I'm doing a couple of deep dives into a couple of big stories that have developed over the weekend and early in the week. Later in the week on Saturday, we'll be doing a proper big episode on the week's updates. But there's a couple of big ones we need to do for our midweek episode. We're going to be looking at what looks to be the first time since the 1970s that shots have been fired in anger on the China-India border. What does this mean? Are we on the road to war? Second, of course, I want to touch quickly on the Disney controversy over the movie Mulan and its connection to the Xinjiang region of the People's Republic of China. Third, I want to talk about what has happened over the weekend and earlier in the week with two Australian journalists who fled the People's Republic of China. This hot off the heels of the detainment last week of Cheng Li, who is a Chinese-born Australian citizen and a famous anchor for state-run media in China. I hope you guys are doing well. Like I said, this is going to be a midweek episode. Some of you guys who watch me know I normally only do one at the end of the week, but I thought this week there is so much on and there's some big stuff that's happened over the weekend. Maybe I can try doing midweek episodes so the ones at the end of the week are not 30-40 minutes anymore. So hopefully you enjoy it. Tell me in the comments what you think of this style of doing it twice a week, whether you prefer to have one in the middle of the week, one at the end, or whether you prefer a big one. Of course, as always, guys, it's a huge help if you enjoyed this video to smash that like button and share the content. YouTube, for some reason, does not like this content. It will not promote the video, even though it just nails the algorithm requirements in terms of engagement and watch time and all that sort of stuff. Unfortunately, it could be tied to the content about China, or it could be because I'm using a VPN to upload it. But at any rate, we can't help that at this point. It's YouTube, it's Google. They're big potatoes. But what you can do is like if you enjoyed the content. And if you do want to support me as well, I have the link to my Patreon below. Now, without further ado, let's jump into this week's midweek episode of China Update. Okay, first up, let's talk about the Sino-Indian border conflict, that the escalation that happened on Monday. At this point in time, almost all of our information is either coming from the People's Liberation Army or from Indian Army statements, neither of which are particularly trustworthy, obviously. So all we're going to do is look at what's being said, what analysts are saying, and what this could mean going forward. It is a very serious development. Now, you guys have been watching me here for a few months discussing this standoff, which has intensified since May. It blew up in June with a very bloody exchange, and it seemed to have settled down a little bit. It had a flare-up last week, but now we have this shooting. For those of you who haven't been watching, you can check out last week's episode where I give some context, or we can quickly go through a little bit of context for this dispute here. So in short, there are areas of the border between China and India which have not been properly demarcated. Along the Himalaya, or sections of the Himalaya border, there are strategic areas and high ground areas that both sides desire. Now, China and India actually went to war over this issue back in 1962, and since then they have been trying to deal with the issue of demarcation politically, and in the meantime there have been de facto lines or borders or lax line of control in the particular area we're talking about this time, where soldiers patrol both sides, but official demarcation has not been settled at the political level between the two countries' central governments. Now, violent flare-ups have occurred sporadically, and in the early 2000s, both sides agreed that in order to reduce the risk of escalation of conflict, soldiers patrolling the LAC, the line of actual control, the de facto border in the disputed area that we're talking about this time, like I said, would not carry weapons. Over the last few years, the frequency of incidents has increased. That is, incidents where there's been a conflict or a clash or a scuffle of some sort between both sides. This year, these incidents reached a boiling point, which led to a particularly violent clash, like I said, which we've covered in detail here when it happened in June, where Chinese troops beat to death around 20 Indian soldiers with clubs and stones. The Chinese side has yet to confirm the number of casualties or whether there are any casualties on the Chinese side. Though not confirmed, it seems on balance these incidents involved PLA, People's Liberation Army troops, crossing to the Indian side of the line of actual control. Since then, central governments on both sides have been seeking, publicly at least, a diplomatic fix and de-escalation. So, where are we now? It appears that there has been yet another confrontation along the Sino-Indian border this week on Monday, and a major escalation between two massive nuclear powers. Firearms were fired in anger for the first time since 1975. At this point, I should also say that there are conflicting and unconfirmed reports that suggest that there was another confrontation on August 31st. Shots may have also been fired as warning shots too on that occasion. But like I said, these have not been confirmed. So before we look at the Indian statements, what is the Chinese side saying about the Monday incident? A spokesperson for the People's Liberation Army Western Theatre Command issued a statement accusing the Indian side of, quote, outrageously firing warning shots, end quote, at Chinese soldiers. The statement included an interesting phrase that India has set a, quote, vile precedent, end quote. This was repeated in several state media accounts of the incident. This term precedent is interesting as it suggests that the Chinese side is signaling that they can now view the firing of weapons as legitimate, as a precedent has been set by India. It could also prove useful in PR work, as future escalations by firing weapons could be blamed on India setting the precedent. Indeed, both the state-run Global Times and the People's Daily accused the Indian side of, quote, firing the first shot, end quote, a phrase that we have seen in state media in recent months in relation to Taiwan as well as India, with state media producing articles with titles like, quote, China will not fire the first shot, end quote. For example, yesterday, the editor-in-chief of the state-run Global Times, Hu Xinjiang, wrote, quote, I must warn the Indian side that the PLA does not fire the first shot, but if the Indian army fires the first shot at the PLA, the consequence must be the annihilation of the Indian army on the spot, end quote. This is setting the stage for a narrative that goes something like this. China sought peaceful engagement, but the Indian side forced conflict on us, and we had no choice but to defend ourselves. Okay, so what is the Indian side saying? Well, it's actually pretty simple. The Indian army in a statement on Tuesday said, actually it was the Chinese troops that crossed the border, as they've been doing for months now, and, quote, fired a few rounds in the air in an attempt to intimidate, end quote. In an interview, retired Indian diplomat Ms. Niparama Rao observed, quote, the structure of relations that the two countries have built over the last 3 decades has come apart, end quote. As I've said over and over again, what is dangerous about all of this is that each time there is an incident, an escalation, then the likelihood of mistake that blows up into wider conflict or war increases as well. While we cannot know exactly what happened in this incident, what we do know is that it is concerning for world peace generally. Now, I just want to briefly touch on this Mulan mess, this Disney fiasco, that there's this mess that they seem to have run into. It's already been covered very comprehensively on YouTube what exactly the outrage in many Western countries, particularly the United States, is all about. I'm sure you all know about the Xinjiang controversy with the new live-action film of Mulan, though it touches on a few important themes for our purposes, like how Hollywood is influenced by the desire to sell to a Chinese market, and how American companies that try to operate in both the US and the Chinese market can stand on public relations landmines at time, like the NBA did last year and again this year. This really by itself is not a huge geopolitical, diplomatic, or policy or economic development within China, so we normally wouldn't discuss it. If it does blow up into something bigger, I will discuss it in detail in a further episode. But what I did want to bring up, why I did want to bring it up on this occasion is basically one reason. The People's Republic of China Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian was asked by reporters yesterday, Tuesday, Beijing time, about the Disney controversy, and I think it is worth quoting part of his response as well as looking at media responses, just to remind ourselves what exactly China's official position is on the Xinjiang, the incredibly controversial, grave situation in Xinjiang at the moment. So this is what he said, quote, I must point out that the so-called Xinjiang issues are not about ethnicity, religion, or human rights, but about fighting violence, terrorism, and separatism. There is no so-called re-education camps in Xinjiang. The vocational education and training program is a meaningful and useful exploration in prevention, counterterrorism, and de-radicalization. The same day that statement was made by the Foreign Ministry spokesperson, the former head of the Ethnic and Religious Affairs Committee of the National Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, part of the Lianghui, the two sessions that met earlier this year, was quoted in state media as saying, quote, "Anti-China forces have become addicted to targeting China's policy in Xinjiang and the vocational education and training centers over the years, like some addicts who cannot help using drugs." End quote. And last up on the special midweek episode of China Update, we're going to talk about these two Australian journalists as well as the detainment of Cheng Lei, which we'll touch on now. Okay, so about a week ago, news broke that a People's Republic of China-born Australian citizen and popular anchor for state-run CGTV, Cheng Lei, was unexpectedly detained in Beijing, the capital. Though this case is very curious, I didn't think it was big enough at the time to mention here. However, this week, the only two China-based reporters for Australian news outlets remaining in the PRC had to flee back to Australia after a days-long diplomatic standoff. What is going on? Well, the rumour mill is in full swing, with theories both outlandish and plausible being offered. This channel is about discussing what we do know, though, rather than speculation. I'm sure there are several channels on YouTube, I can think of a few in my head right now, that are going to discuss all the salacious theories and outlandish theories as well, like I said, some of the plausible theories. But at this point, it is unclear whether there is a serious connection between the two, and if there is, what is the nature of that, and what exactly is going on with either of these events or the events together. We don't know, for example, what the People's Republic of China motivations might be behind them, even though I feel like something fishy may be afoot. All we can do is look at exactly what happened, what we do know, and try and do some basic analysis based on our limited knowledge at this point. The two journalists involved are Bill Birtles of the Australian Broadcasting Company, ABC, and Michael Smith of the Australian Financial Review. On the 31st of August, the Australian government announced that Cheng Lei had been detained on the 14th of August. About that time, early last week, Bill and Michael were both warned by the embassy that they should leave the country. Both of them were in People's Republic at that time. Last Wednesday at about midnight in Beijing, while Bill was enjoying a farewell party with friends, police arrived and informed him that he was under an exit ban, meaning he couldn't leave the country, and that the Ministry of State Security would be talking to him the following afternoon. Around the same time, the same thing happened to Michael in Shanghai. The following day, Bill took shelter in the Australian embassy in Beijing, and Michael did the same in the Shanghai consulate. After 5 days of high-level diplomatic negotiations, they both agreed to have 1-hour-long interviews and that they were allowed to leave the country. They got back to Australia on Tuesday of this week, and soon after they arrived, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian announced that Cheng Lei had been arrested and is being investigated for, quote, criminal activity endangering China's national security, end quote. In separate interviews, both journalists expressed that they did not know Ms. Cheng particularly well, and that police interviews only contained, quote-unquote, superficial questions about her. Smith expressed that he believes that the police interviews were, quote, an attempt at intimidation, end quote. Now, this is all that we really know about these events so far. This is, of course, within the context of a serious diplomatic dispute between China and Australia. This is also in the context of a tit-for-tat journalist state media employee expulsion between the United States and China. On this point, though, I would like to correct a mischaracterization that I have seen in several articles this week, including the New York Times. This here is a quote from the Times. I'll read you this quote now that I think is a mischaracterization. Quote, in March, Beijing expelled 14 American journalists working at the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post in retaliation for the Trump administration's decision to restrict staff at Chinese state media outlets in the United States, end quote. Now, I've seen similar lines to this sort of quote in other publications this week that have been discussing this tit-for-tat issue with journalism between the US and China. What I wish to point out here is that this language is very misleading, as it suggests that these journalist issues all started with the US administration decision to restrict state-run media staff. However, this particular US move was itself in response to Beijing ejecting 3 journalists from the Wall Street Journal earlier in February as COVID was blowing up in China, which you may remember we actually covered on this channel at that time. Beijing said at that time that the expulsion was due to the quote-unquote offensive article that the journal had written at that time, which had criticized the government's response to COVID-19. But at any rate, let's go back to the story about the Australian journalists within the context of the wider China-Australia relationship. What is the Chinese side saying officially? On Wednesday, Chinese state media, beginning with a Global Times exclusive, ran articles claiming that Australia has in fact been the one abusing Chinese journalists. In the piece, they said, quote, "Staff from the Australian Intelligence Agency recently raided the residences of Chinese journalists in Australia and questioned them, seizing their computers and smartphones, and asked them not to report the incident," a source close to the matter told the Global Times on Tuesday. This is Tuesday, yesterday. The brutal and barbaric acts of Australian authorities against Chinese journalists were contrary to freedom of the press, revealing the ghost of McCarthyism, experts said, while urging anti-China forces in Australia to put down their obsession. The white terror against Chinese citizens and organizations will not suppress China's righteous spirit, and the chilling effect will not stop the voice of justice from the international community, the experts said. End quote. The white terror here could be referring to the events of the same name during the French Revolution, or the more recent example several decades ago in Taiwan. It could also have racial undertones. The same paper wrote in an editorial last week, quote, "If Australia doesn't open up its economy and reduce unemployment, it risks becoming the poor white trash of Asia," end quote. For those of you still watching, on a personal note, this story really hits home for me a little bit. 2 of the 3 peoples, Bill, the journalist who was based in Beijing, and Cheng Lei, are both people that I actually know. Cheng Lei, I actually met her several times. She was dating an Australian fella when I was based in Beijing, and I actually did some contract work for him over a few months, and I met her on several occasions. Very lovely woman, pretty liberal, lovely woman. It was my impression of her. And Bill, I've actually had several dinners with him over the last few years when I was based in Beijing. I have him on my phone. I've chatted with him on occasion recently since I left Beijing. But I sat down and had meals with him, and like, he was a really hard-working, pretty honest journalist. Was my impression of the guy. So I am concerned about Cheng Lei, who's in detention at the moment. But I am happy to hear that these journalists, particularly Bill, has got back safely to Australia. For someone who is based here at the moment, these are the sort of things that you worry about sometimes. It's a real concern. What if you get a knock on the door? That's always in the back of your head. This guy was writing about some pretty dangerous stuff at times. I'm glad that he's out of the country, he's back home with his family and his friends, and that he's safe. Okay guys, that is our special midweek version of China Update. I will be back at the end of the week, Friday or Saturday, to do a proper full week version. Hopefully breaking it down like this and making it shorter is a little bit more digestible for you guys. Sometimes it's hard to sit down with 30-40 minutes. Like I said, tell me what you think in the comments below. I'd be interested to know what you think about me changing up the format like this. As always, thank you again for watching. Don't forget to like if you haven't yet. Share if you think there's someone who would enjoy this content. Wherever you are, hope you're keeping safe and keeping sane. I will see you all next time on China Update. Okay, take 2. I fucked up. Hopefully these shorter, breaking it down this and guys, I literally just filmed the entire episode and I lost the recording, so I'm filming it again. In an interview, retired Indian diplomat Ms. Nirupama, breaking it.